Welcome. Welcome to today's event co-hosted by CDP and GRI. This webinar is going to be on measuring and disclosing the private sector's impact on the SDGs. If we go to the next slide. The key objective of this session is to explore how to harness the power and raise the ambition of the private sector to help achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. Please make sure that the audience's microphones are on mute. This will be an interactive panel, so please submit any comments or questions that you have via the message box, and there'll be a Q&A session at the very end where we will sort of ask the panel your questions. Next page, please. So a little bit of a review of the session structure. We're going to start with a welcome and introduction by Sue Howes, who is CDP's Chief Operating Officer for CDP Worldwide. Then we're going to, I think we're actually having some trouble getting Thomas Dodd to attend, so this one's going to be on hold, I think, for the moment. And then we're going to have an interactive panel discussion and Q&A session with an illustrious panel here today. We've got Enrico Giovannini, the Director of the Italian Alliance for Sustainable Development. We are still trying to get Sammy on the line, but we've got Johanna Levy, Senior Director of Global Environmental Excellence, and Monica Kozilek, Chief Specialist Statistics Officer from Poland, and then Tom Bregman, Head of Corporate Engagement at Future Fit Foundations. Finally, we're going to have our co-host, GRI, Sarah Jane Dominic, give conclusions and the next steps. Next slide, please. And I will hand this over now to Sue Howes.
Helen, thank you very much. And I would like to echo Helen's welcome. So a very warm welcome to everyone to this afternoon session. As Helen said, we're focusing over the next 90 minutes on measuring and disclosing the private sector's impact on the SDGs. We have a great lineup of speakers, and I just want to say a big thank you to our speakers today. Thank you for the time you're committing to this event. I think it's going to be very worthwhile, and I really look forward to your contributions. But our aim in the next 90 minutes is really to underline how crucial measurement and disclosure and the resulting data and insights are to the enhancing sustainable decision-making and strengthening private sector accounting. Their accountability in terms of their impacts. And what we're going to do today is have a special focus with regard to their environmental impacts. Next slide, please. So for those of you that may not be familiar with CDP, we're actually approaching our 20th birthday. So we've been working in this space since the year 2000. And our vision is to see a thriving economy that works for people and planet in the long term. Now, in terms of our unique contribution to this vision, what we do is we focus some key stakeholders. These are the investors, companies and cities, and we focus them on taking urgent action to build a truly sustainable economy. And this is where the crux of the conversation today. We are all about measurement, reporting and disclosure. And by doing that, those key stakeholders can really understand their environmental impact. And obviously, we're looking for them to take action. Next slide, please. Just a few key statistics. In 2020, CDP is working with over 500 institutional investors who have combined assets of over $100 trillion. Now, we really sort of span the whole of the capital market space, whether the investors are asset managers or asset owners, whether they are banks, insurance companies, private equity. And these investors are really critical in terms of driving action by requesting environmental information from their key stakeholders who are the companies. So investors are very, very important to our work, and providing data to the financial sector is critical if we want to see them shifting capital into more sustainable investments. We also work with a group of multinational companies who have really gone to the second stage of the journey. So they have measured and reported their own direct environmental impact, but they have really got to understand the fact that they need to be looking across their whole value chain. So here we work with these companies to engage their suppliers, and this has really been a very key driver of increased disclosure and measurement. The stats I have on the slide in terms of responding companies, cities, states and regions are from our 2019 cycle. And we are planning very, very soon to share with you our 2020 numbers. But for last year, we had over 8,500 companies reporting through the CDP disclosure platform. We had over 800 cities and 120 states and regions. So we really are operating at scale, and we provide these data, this information to many stakeholders within the ecosystem, whether they are data providers to financial institutions, fellow NGOs, governments, policymakers, regulators. So CDP is really looking to be the primary data source for environmental information. Next slide, please. In terms of our work currently, we touch on 6 of the critical elements of the SDGs. We work across climate change, fresh water, and deforestation. And our vision and questionnaire aligns with these SDGs. We're actually currently working on our strategy out to 2025, and we're looking at how we can align more fully across the whole element of the E, the environmental piece. And we're also looking at how we can partner and support others in terms of the S and the G. And the conversation today is going to be focused very much around those environmental impacts. Next slide, please. So at CDP, we really do believe very strongly that information is critical to drive action and performance. And really, disclosure is really the first stage of the journey. Once a company or a city or a state has gone through the process of gathering all of the relevant information and then disclosing that information publicly, they can gain insight and their stakeholders can gain insight. But this then enables action and performance. The private sector is so critical in terms of its contribution to the SDGs. The more of our stakeholders that do measure and disclose, the more we will have a better understanding of our progress towards achieving our goals for 2030. And I think we're very clear that government has a very key role to play in this, because they can both take action to address market failures and also they can boost ambition. So we want to ensure that policymakers, regulators have optimal access to all of the information that is currently available. We understand there are data gaps, and we need to think about those data collaborations and those new innovations that can make sure we're getting the right information into the right places. Next slide, please. So I'd like to thank GRI for this next slide. This is sourced from a GRI research report, and this is something that they have been working on for the last 5 years, where they're actually considering how the private sector is engaging with countries when countries put together their voluntary national reviews. So I just want to walk you through a couple of key lines here. The top line just shows the number of countries that are presenting their VNRs, and we're looking at a sample size of 50 here. So we can see that, especially in the last 3 years, we have had a very high level of participation. I seem to have lost the slides. We've got them back. Thank you. So the first line, just to reiterate, shows we have very good uptake here. Countries are presenting their VNRs. In 2020, we have 47 out of 50 countries, and each year this sample group changes. We have different countries contributing. The second line illustrates how those countries are consulting with the private sector. And again, we have some very good numbers here. We have around sort of 85, 90% over the last 5 years. So we can see really strong consultation with the private sector, which is exactly what we want to be seeing. However, if we jump down to the fourth line, in terms of how many countries are referring to CSR and sustainability reports, the numbers are less promising. If we consider in 2020, when we had 47 countries participating, only 21 of those actually referred to all of that critical information that is included within CSR and sustainability reports. So here we absolutely see a gap. What are we missing? What progress are we not able to monitor? So we really want to encourage countries to really tap in to all of the sustainability reporting information that we have available. And as I've already illustrated, at CDP, we have much of this information, as do our friends at GRI and others within the environmental ecosystem. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. And I just really wanted to sum up by sharing with you some pretty concerning statistics, actually, from the UN Secretary General's 2020 SDG report. And I think sort of the first bullet point is the one that we need to really think through carefully and take on board. The world is only on track to meet 22% of the environment-related SDGs if the current trends continue. 22%, it's a pretty low number. And for 68% of the environment-related SDGs, there is not sufficient data at the global level to assess progress. We're seeing really large data gaps existing in terms of geographic coverage, timeliness, and the level of disaggregation required. New sources of data, such as corporate sustainability data, the elements I've just been talking about, can really enable more agile, efficient, and evidence-based decision-making, and can lead to better measurement of progress towards our SDG goals. And this is really the true value of what CDP brings to the table. We need to have that ability to be able to track progress, to better target interventions and investments. We need to ensure that the right actions are taken, and to verify that the actions taken are producing results without unintended consequences. I don't need to express to you what a challenging year 2020 has been. At CDP, we're quite astonished that the corporate reporting levels are so high in such a challenging year for many, many companies. And we hope this really does reflect that companies are really incorporating sustainability into their business models. It's not just a nice to have add-on, but from a government's perspective, we really need to ensure that when governments are putting together their recovery strategies to come out of the coronavirus pandemic, that they truly are building back better. And they are looking to address climate change, nature loss, and social inequalities in line with the SDGs. I think the SDGs can provide such a critical framework for those recovery strategies. So my final words to sum up: we're really looking for better data, better tracking of progress, which will ultimately lead to better interventions, enable the right actions to be taken, and ultimately we want to see the desired results and the outcomes that we all want to see. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to the next hour and 10 minutes. And Helen, back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sue, on your overview on why this topic is just so important. If we could go to the next slide, please. So we are expecting Thomas Dodd to give a high-level overview here of the landscape in Europe. However, I don't think he's able to join us today, unfortunately. So if we'd like to sort of move on to the next slide, I do want to sort of just give a very quick sort of overview of what Thomas was going to discuss. And I'd like to sort of bring this up at later points sort of within the panel discussion. So really, there's a lot happening in the policy landscape in Europe. It's rapidly changing, and sort of what are going to have to be the key changes to companies and financial institutions on how they're going to have to adapt. We've got the European Green New Deal, which is an opportunity to show progress on the environmental SDG goals in Europe. We've also got the integration of the SDGs in the European semester as announced by the President of the EU Commission, which is also an opportunity for the EU to better deliver its commitments. And then also, importantly, member states and the EU are currently working on delivering their recovery strategies from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And how do these recovery plans address climate change, nature loss, and societal inequalities in line with the SDGs? And where does the private sector fit into this? So, moving on to our interactive panel discussion, we've got key questions I want to pose here to sort of everyone at the start of this is, how can we raise ambition of the private sector in Europe to accelerate action to reach the 2030 SDG targets? And then also, how can we track this? How can national statistic offices use this corporate environmental data on the SDGs for the voluntary national reviews? So first off, if we go to the next slide, we're going to start with Enrico Giovannini.
Yes,
slide, please.
Good afternoon.
Welcome.
Can you hear me well?
We can, yes.
Great. Good afternoon to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here presenting the experience of the Italian Alliance for Sustainable Development, which is the largest ever organized network of Italian civil society with the aim of pushing our country and Europe towards the implementation of the 2030 agenda. ASVIS has more than 270 organizations, including the 11 largest business associations, from Confindustria to Confagricoltura, Confcommercio, and so on and so forth. Individual companies cannot be part of ASVIS. So the other 260 organizations are trade unions, voluntary organizations, environmental organizations, and so on and so forth, including several public sector institutions. Our work is aimed at pushing the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And of course, among the various things that we do, including education, policy advice, advocacy, and so on, is also the push to have the private sector aligned to SDGs, especially in Italy. This is a big challenge because we have relatively to other countries few large enterprises, some medium-sized enterprises, but then a lot of small-sized enterprises. And this, of course, is a problem, as the adoption of SDGs for the reporting and in general aligning business policies to SDGs come from the largest enterprises first, and then go down. I would like to make here 4 points for discussion. The first one is that we welcome the review of the European directive on the non-financial reporting, and unfortunately Italy made a huge mistake in 2016, limiting the obligation to compile non-financial reporting to very few large enterprises. This was a push from business associations who thought that this was just a cost, and unfortunately the government followed their advice in 2016, but now even these organizations, business organizations, recognized that was a mistake, because this is a competitive element today. Not only because the private sector is going in this direction anyway, but especially as the financial sector asks for this kind of reporting to finance sustainable companies, let me put it this way. So political decisions are extremely important, and we are pushing to have Italy following, for example, the example of Spain that 18 months ago put down the threshold for the mandatory non-financial reporting to 250 employees. The second point is that we need to link the business data to statistical data. And this takes me back when I was president of the Italian Statistical Office, and before that, chief statistician at the OECD, when with GRI, we tried to compare the definitions of GRI indicators with those definitions that are included in statistical surveys, in order exactly to match the micro data with the macro data at sectoral level. We did a pilot exercise, then this was not followed by in the following years, but this is very important because very often the companies' reports are telling you what they're doing and whether they're doing better compared to the previous year, for example, but not necessarily what they do in comparison with other companies of the same sector. So we need this meso and macro data in order to compare the micro data. The third point is a positive experience at the Italian Statistical Office, because over the last few years, they run very large surveys on the attitudes of companies towards sustainability, not only environmental, but also social sustainability. And the result was extremely interesting because other things equal, companies that decided to go for sustainability have productivity gains, which are extremely relevant. 15% for very large enterprises, 10% for large enterprises, 5% for medium-sized enterprises. And this is great in terms of narrative, and especially for those companies who decided to go towards circular economy, this is easily understandable because they try to reduce 70% of costs and not the 30% of costs, which are the labor costs. Then quickly to the last 2 points, we need to rethink the indicators of competitiveness, for example, because we need to overcome the idea that technological changes are very difficult while adjustment to labor force is easier. In the circular economy framework, you may reduce the total costs thanks to the reuse of materials. Maybe you even need more people, but your overall costs go down and profits go up. Well, if you use the very well-established unilabor cost as indicator of competitiveness, you don't get anything about what's going on. Even worse, you get the wrong signal. The very last point is that, again, and the Italian Statistical Office has run in May, after the lockdown, a survey about the attitudes of companies about the future of their business after the coronavirus. And this survey is now run again in October, November. Very important result was that linking the attitude of companies towards sustainability before the crisis and the attitudes of companies during the crisis, the share of companies who had decided to go for sustainability, which are already in the recovery phase, relaunch phase, and so on, is much higher than the share of companies who are in the same mood but didn't choose for sustainability before the crisis. And this is telling you that companies who decided for sustainability are also more resilient to crisis. And this is a very important point in this particular context. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really interesting points that you raised there, particularly sort of in terms of the importance of linking business data to statistical data and this sort of need for uniform and comparable indicators that sort of sits, at the heart of really what CDP is doing as well. My question to you is sort of how can we raise the ambition of the private sector, and what does this look like?
Just small information, if you wish. In the logistics sector in Italy, the most difficult professional skill to find on the market is the skill of the calculator of emissions. Why is that? Because the transportation system is moving towards sustainability, and now everybody is competing also in terms of reduction of emissions. But we don't have the skills to do that. This is just to say that things are happening very quickly, depending on the sector. And I think that the choice made by the EU of having the 2030 agenda as overall framework for its policies, including the Recovery and Resilience Plan, the semester, as you said in the introduction, will push quickly in this direction. As I was one of those advisors to the Commission and to political leaders who pushed more than 1 year ago to go in this direction through the report of Sustainable Equality, of course, I'm very happy that the semester now is built on sustainability and 2030 agenda. And I think that this will be followed also by companies if, big if, national governments will be coherent with the approach followed by the Commission. If they will dilute their plans for recovery and resilience with the usual business approach, this message will come much less louder than what would be needed.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. Do we have, I did see him here a second ago, do we have Sami Longjong here? If not, let's go to the next slide whilst hopefully he can connect. Or, sorry, the next speaker pack. So this is Johanna. Wonderful. Okay, so now I'm going to pass the floor on to Johanna Levy, who's the Senior Director of Global Environmental Excellence. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, my pleasure. Can you hear me okay?
We can, yes.
Okay, perfect. So we can move to the next slide. And so good morning, good afternoon, and I'm delighted to share with you today a quick snapshot of our environmental sustainability journey at Firmenich. And many of you in attendance may not know who Firmenich is, so I will share some quick facts in this slide before discussing our environmental strategy and before sharing how working with CDP makes sense for us as a supplier to large consumer goods company to measure and disclose our environmental footprint and our impact on the SDG. Let me turn on my camera. Firmenich is the largest family-owned company in the flavor and fragrance industry. With 10,000 colleagues and revenue of 3.9 billion Swiss francs at the end of fiscal year 2020, we are in more than 100 countries. We were created in 1895 in Geneva, Switzerland, but we've always been more than a company. We're a family with a unique legacy of responsible business. For example, as early as 1991, so 1 year before the Rio meeting made sustainability mainstream, we signed the International Chamber of Commerce Business Charter for Sustainable Development. And since then, we've always been committed to sustainability and to inclusive business. While we are a science-driven organization, Many of our fragrance and flavor solutions depend on nature. For example, it takes 3.5 tons of rose petals to create just 1 kilo of rose essential oil. With that in mind, there is really no other option than to harvest them sustainably if we want our business to thrive for the generations to come. And that's what we've been doing for the past 125 years. In October 2020, so literally just a few weeks ago, we shared our new sustainability strategy based on 3 pillars that you can see here: caring about people, respecting nature, and acting on climate change. And then we can move to the next slide. In 2015, we set 7 ambitious environmental goals for 2020, including working with CDP and asking key suppliers to disclose environmental impact. And that's where, for us, CDP is really part of our strategy. We started disclosing as a company to CDP in 2008. And in 2018, we reached CDP AAA for water, climate change, and forest. So we know from experience that the journey from disclosing to environmental excellence takes time. Another goal was to power all of our sites with renewable electricity, and we attained that milestone in February 2020, reaching zero manufacturing waste to landfill and cut absolute Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 20% by 2020. We reached and exceeded this goal in 2019. So for the last year, we've been working on our science-based target, which is aligned with a 1.5 degree scenario, to reduce absolute Scope 1 and Scope 2 CO2 by 55% and Scope 3 emissions from raw materials purchased by 20% by 2030 versus 2017. And then we can move to my last and my next and last slide. So to reach these goals, CDP really helps us measure and disclose our impact on some of the SDG and foster transparency in our supply chain. For example, we know that for all feminist suppliers reporting through CDP, 63% engage their own supply chain on climate change, and 78% report greenhouse gas reduction targets, and that's a 17% increase in just 1 year. So through CDP, we're able to access some granularity of information that really allows us to further drive transparency and drive action. We've also joined RE100, a group of companies committed to 100% renewable electricity before 2050. And through that platform, we can connect and collaborate with like-minded companies to, for example, drive renewable electricity in countries where it's still limited or difficult to access, like Singapore, for example, in alignment with SDG 7. And finally, I talked about our science-based target. As a science-based company, it really makes sense for us to set science-based target. So if you don't know, targets are named science-based if they are aligned with the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We chose to align our emission reductions with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius when we read the IPCC special report that describes the impact of just a 1.5 temperature increase. When this report was released in 2018, it stated that we can successfully limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but for that, we need unprecedented changes. With that in mind, for Firmenich, for many companies, Scope 3 emissions account for 96% of our total footprint. And the main category for us is purchased goods and services. Our science-based target addresses this large source of emission. And that's where it's coming full circle for us, because we use data from our supplier CDP questionnaire to assess our progress against our science-based target. And we use these frameworks to not only drive SDGs, but also to hopefully drive the unprecedented changes that are needed to limit global warming. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Johanna. That was really useful to walk us through the journey of environmental disclosing. sort of your journey and how you're using science-based targets to measure your progress and impact. I've got a question here for you, which is how are you engaging your suppliers on the topic of climate change? And sort of what are the business drivers for your company in this?
Absolutely. And really for us, it's really a focus on unprecedented changes. And as I just discussed, for all companies, the biggest source of emission is Scope 3 emissions. For us, it's 96%, but if you look at publicly available literature, it's anywhere between 70 and 95%. So it's always a very large portion. For us in Scope 3, the largest part is purchased goods and services and raw materials purchased. So when you stop for just 1 second, very often our own emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, are dwarfed by our suppliers' emission, by our Scope 3 emissions. So if you're serious about climate action, and honestly, we have to be now, because the literature is also very clear on that, you have to also address your Scope 3 emissions. And beyond just driving impact, and I think that's why everybody is here today, sustainability is about sharing best practices. And I think that's the goal of today's conversation, sharing best practices. Well, some of the actions, some of the initiatives that we've learned on, we're very happy to share. For example, we achieved 100% renewable electricity, while simultaneously, in some places, generating net savings by entering strategic long-term price contracts at very good market timings. So we're happy to share that experience with our suppliers. So really, engagement is about driving actions and sharing best practices.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I also just want at this point to remind our audience that we will be having a question and answer session at the end. So please do submit any questions that you may have in the chat box. We're hoping for this to be as interactive as possible. Okay, next slide, please. And our next guest, we're very excited to have Monika Boniziak, and she is the Chief Specialist of Statistics for Poland. So welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monika Gorzelak. I'm from Statistics Poland. I work in the section responsible for SDG monitoring for both global and national needs. I've taken part in the development of national and business SDG indicators. Speaking of which, thank you so much for an opportunity to share the perspective of the NSO on tracking progress of private sector towards the SDGs. Let me first start with the role. So could you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So let me first start with the role of Statistics Poland in the development of already mentioned SDG business indicators, which are commonly known in Poland as impact barometer. So to cut a long story short, the role of Statistics Poland is that of a substantive partner. This time, instead of data, we provide expertise and guidance on how to develop a robust monitoring framework. So let me now proceed to a very short description of how Impact Barometer has been actually developed and what actors have been involved in that process. The Impact Barometer indicators have been built within the 17 Goals campaign, which is a national cross-sectoral initiative whose main objective is to encourage Polish private sector to act for the SDGs. The initiator of that campaign, and by implication, the initiator of Impact Barometer indicators, is a Polish advisory firm specializing in sustainability and in CSR. Equally important, that firm called CSR Consulting has invited a wide range of actors to join the development of the indicators. including expert staff from Statistics Poland, NGOs, business community, as well as academia and CSR experts. Furthermore, business SDG indicators for Polish private sector are developed under the honorary patronage of the Line Ministry that coordinates SDG implementation in Poland. In the very initial stage of the process, there have been selected 6 SDGs of key importance for Polish business, and they include SDG 3, 4, 5, 8, 9, and 12. And then the 30 indicators have been selected for these goals. Could you please move on to the next slide? The next slide, please. Thank you. What is most important about the impact barometer is the fact that the indicators are based on corporate data. I mean, it is companies themselves that calculate the indicators with their own micro data. And all the company has to do is to download an Excel file, which is available on the official website of the 17 Goals campaign. The Excel file includes 30 indicators along with methodological guidance and formulas. So the company has to just read the instructions, enter the required data variables into suitable cells, and then the indicators are instantly calculated. However, these are only individual results. The next step will be to calculate the aggregates so that some generalizations on the overall impact of the private sector in Poland can be made. Since Impact Barometer is a brand new tool, and due to the fact that it has been released just before the spread of the pandemic, the project is at the moment of collecting individual results. However, it is hoped that it will be possible to calculate and release the aggregates in September next year. So stay tuned. And the last slide, please. The list of business SDG indicators for Polish private sector is also available on Statistics Poland's national reporting platform. And for those of you who are interested in the initiative, I strongly also recommend the UNEC roadmap on statistics for the SDGs, where you will find a case study prepared by Statistics Poland describing the whole project and providing some general recommendations for NSOs. Thank you very much for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Monica. Really interesting to hear the use of non-traditional data in Poland in tracking progress on the private sector towards the SDGs. And my question here to you is, what were some of the challenges with Impact Barometer that you faced, which other countries and other sort of statistical offices can learn from?
Fine. So I think that the biggest challenge still is to encourage as many companies as possible to use Impact Barometer and then apply its results into the sustainability reports. Another challenge is diversity of companies themselves in terms of both the activity and the size. And I think that the biggest challenge is still ahead of us, and it concerns the integration of these unofficial data into the whole ecosystem of SDG statistics.
Brilliant, thank you. All right, so our next panelist if we go on to the next slide, is Tom Bregman, who is Head of Corporate Engagement at Future Fit Foundation. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Helen, and thanks to both CDP and GRI for the invitation to speak today. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for those who don't know me, my name is Tom Bregman, and I'm Head of Corporate Engagement at the Future Fit Foundation. That means I work very closely with businesses to find new ways of addressing society's biggest challenges. And for those that are unfamiliar with Future Fit, it's not-for-profit based in London with the mission of accelerating the shift to society to one that is environmentally restorative, socially just, and economically inclusive. In short, we take systems science and translate it into free open source tools that can support businesses to credibly measure and manage and then disclose the negative and positive impacts associated with their supply chains, operations, and products, and then hopefully over time amplify the positive impact that they can have on people and the planet. Now, one of the most frequently asked questions that I get when I work with a new business is, how does Future Fit in with the plethora of other initiatives that are out there? And the Sustainable Development Goals are usually top of that list. Now, that's unsurprising given the attention that governments and other stakeholders are placing on the SDGs, and also conferences like this. So what I want to spend the next few minutes doing is just talking about how we see businesses currently engaging with the SDGs and what can be done to ensure that the SDGs themselves can actually help drive real business impact. So at Future Fit, we work with a number of businesses on our development council, and some of those are listed here. It's a mixture of companies and investors who really help us road test our guidance and make sure that we can embed it and then scale it. Next slide, please. We've also reviewed a significant number of sustainability and annual reports over the past few years, and have found that businesses typically respond to the SDGs in one of three patterns. Next slide, please. So those three patterns that we identified are a defensive approach, a selective approach, and a holistic approach. Okay, so the first approach, the defensive one, quite commonly seen, is for a business to tell a story about what it's already doing on topics related to the SDGs, rather than exploring new ways to improve. For example, a business might say it's contributing to SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, merely because it's creating jobs. But what if those jobs are paying less than a living wage? The second approach is to consider just one or a few of the 17 SDGs. For instance, a pharmaceutical company may choose to focus on SDG 3, good health and well-being, by making medicines that help people to live productive lives. Such efforts may indeed be a genuine contribution to that SDG if those medicines are affordable and accessible to those that need them most. But the question I would like businesses to ask themselves is whether this is enough. What if manufacturing those medicines uses large amounts of fresh water, as it commonly does? And what if that production takes place in water-stressed regions? For local communities in those regions, the company could actually be undermining SDG 6, clean water and sanitation. And likewise, what if that same company can only bring those medicines to market profitably by relying on low-cost suppliers who aren't paying their workers a living wage? In that case, they're more likely to be keeping people in poverty, so therefore undermining SDG 1, no poverty. So given the interconnectedness of the systems, this selective approach could lead to undesirable effects elsewhere and could therefore be counterproductive. And it's not to say that businesses aren't trying to drive positive impact. Many of them are, and many of them are very well-meaning. but they might inadvertently, by taking a selective approach, be exacerbating one problem whilst trying to solve another. So this brings us to the third pattern, and unfortunately, this is the one that is probably most rarely seen amongst businesses, a holistic approach. And this is one which considers all of a company's SDG impacts, both positive and negative, across the company's value web. No business decision is ever free of trade-offs, but if we take a systems approach by looking at all of the interactions between the company and its suppliers, customers, other socioeconomic actors, and the environment, it is possible to identify otherwise unforeseen issues and avoid those trade-offs. And when those trade-offs are seen, they can be anticipated and avoided, or at the very least case mitigated. Next slide, please. So what's really clear is that we need some way of measuring what good enough looks like. And so the need for what we call a well-defined extra financial break-even point, which is the point at which a business can say that it's not undermining any goals, and for a way to steer progress toward it and beyond it, is actually what led us to create the Future Fit Business Benchmark. The business benchmark itself is divided into two parts. The first are a set of 23 break-even goals, which cover all critical business areas, from worker well-being and water use through to procurement practices and product performance. And together, these 23 goals really draw that line in the sand for what every business must do to ensure that it's eliminated all of its negative impacts, and also to exert what influence it can do on the stakeholders it relies on to deliver its products and services. So, for instance, its suppliers. This may seem a lot, and if you take a look at our website, you can see what's required for each of these break-even goals. It's going to take businesses many years to achieve all 23 break-even goals, but it's really important that we recognize that as the ultimate endpoint. And long before any business reaches those goals, there are lots of other things that it can do, driving positive impact, for instance. So we've got a set of 24 positive pursuits, which describe systemic outcomes which actually speed up our collective progress. We've mapped all of these break-even goals and positive pursuits to the Sustainable Development Goals at an indicator level. So by looking at these break-even goals and positive pursuits, you can, at the end of it, begin to describe in a credible and holistic way how your business is impacting the SDGs in a positive way, but also potentially undermining them. So what I want to finish with is a question for the audience, really, and one that I would love everyone to leave the room and take away, is, can you truly say that your business or the businesses that you work with are taking a holistic approach to managing and measuring against the SDGs? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom, for that thoughtful sort of reflection on planetary boundaries and societal needs, whether data alone is enough, and sort of what these trade-offs are. A quick question for you is, how do you think the world's financial institutions, what should they do to help accelerate the transition to an SDG-friendly society, specifically in Europe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think financial institutions and investors in particular have a heavy burden and heavy weight to carry when it comes to driving the SDGs, and they're often looked at as the silver bullet in trying to drive change, and then themselves have their own business models. So I think it's tricky for any investor to drive change at scale because of some of the leverage or lack of leverage that they have over individual institutions. But that said, we've seen a huge uptick in finance sector interest in our approach to aligning with planetary boundaries and driving towards the SDGs. Last year, LD Pensions, a Danish pension fund, released the world's first Future Fit mandate. That's now going to be managed by Nordea Asset Management, where they have to incorporate our positive pursuits into the management of their fund. So more generally, I think the first thing that financial institutions, both banks and investors, need to do is require their portfolio companies and clients to disclose not just how they're driving positive change towards the SDGs, but also the ways in which they're potentially undermining progress towards their goals. And I think wherever possible, try and provide incentives to that, whether that be, better lending rates or whatever that may be. I think that there is a role there to be played by the finance sector in really creating those incentives for real change.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm now delighted to invite Thomas Dodd, who wasn't able to join us earlier due to technical difficulties, which always seem to happen during these events. If we can go back up to his slides, Thomas is going to give us a sort of ending reflection on the high-level policy landscape overview in Europe, and sort of starting to outline what the key changes are and how companies and financial institutions are going to have to adapt. Welcome, Thomas.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Good.
And you have about 5 minutes.
Sorry?
We have about 5 minutes for this.
5 minutes, okay. Well, I work in the European Commission. I work in our Directorate General that deals with the financial industry, amongst other things. I work specifically on what we still call non-financial reporting, so that the European law that sets out what non-financial and sustainability information companies should report. That is the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, and the European Commission has announced that it will put forward a proposal to revise that directive in the first quarter of next year. Essentially, more and better sustainability information from companies is a critical element of the European Commission's Green Deal ambition, and is a critical element of our sustainable finance agenda. You don't have to dig very far to find ample evidence that the sustainability information currently reported by companies is not sufficiently comparable. It's very often not reliable or not perceived as reliable. Large amounts of information that users think is relevant tends to be missing, and some companies don't report at all, or are under no obligation to report this kind of information. If you look at the problems that creates from the point of view of users of this information, no big surprises, but it's worth running through it. The investment community cannot take account of the sustainability risks to its investments if it does not have adequate information about those risks from investee companies. And that has potentially serious systemic and financial stability risks and implications. That's why central banks are increasingly interested in this, particularly, but not only from the climate perspective. Also, the investment community cannot channel more resources to companies that will address and not exacerbate the sustainability crisis. Why? Because they don't know about the impacts of the companies in which they might invest. If you look from the point of view of other users of this information, perhaps particularly civil society organizations, clearly they cannot adequately hold companies to an account for their impacts. Why? Because they don't have adequate information about what those impacts are. The current situation, as far as we can tell, is also fairly unsatisfactory from the point of view of reporting companies who face a wide range of different standards, frameworks, guidelines, many of which overlap, which are consistent in some respects and not in others. And this leads to quite a lot of cost and confusion for reporting companies. So what do we think the European Commission might propose to change when it puts forward its proposal to revise the non-financial reporting directive? The short answer, of course, is we ultimately don't know, and we won't know until the European Commission at political level decides early next year. But it's fairly obvious that there are some critical issues we can already identify. One is about scope, by which we mean which companies should be subject to sustainability reporting requirements. Another is about audit and assurance. Essentially, European law requires the audit of financial information, but doesn't require the audit or assurance of non-financial information. So it may be that, to a certain extent, needs to change. The third issue is really about specifying the content of what it is that companies should report. And this leads directly to the question of reporting standards. In our view at working level, and I think this view is increasingly shared at political level, the question of reporting standards is really the single most important and powerful element of any revision of the non-financial reporting directive. We don't essentially think that the identified problems can be addressed without a requirement on companies to use common reporting standards. We ran a public consultation from February till June this year, and a very high percentage, 82% of all respondents, whether they were reporting companies, whether they were users of information or others, replied that they thought a requirement on companies to use common reporting standards would be necessary to address the problems that are out there. As many of you may know, we've therefore tasked EFRAG, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, to carry out some exploratory work on the development of EU non-financial reporting standards, and their first set of recommendations are due at the end of January. In order not to go too far over my 5 minutes, one or two words about challenges that we see. First of all, on the SDGs. The EU is almost by definition a very strong supporter of the SDGs, and we recognize their huge value in terms of mobilization of different actors. Reporting against the SDGs comes with its own challenges, and I think a number of the speakers that I've had the privilege of listening to when the technical issue allowed me this afternoon have addressed some of them. But I think from our side, there is a genuine question about how do we avoid this becoming just good news reporting. The probable revision of the non-financial reporting directive is indicative of a trend towards a much more rigorous reporting framework for sustainability information, and away really from some of the roots of sustainability reporting in companies, which, if we are honest, has been driven at least to some extent by marketing and image. Essentially, reporting against the SDGs, or indeed against any other objectives, probably requires the definition of performance criteria for companies. That is something that the European taxonomy has tried to do. So it tries to translate European policy objectives into performance criteria per economic activity. The second and last challenge I wanted to highlight is one about European and global approaches to non-financial reporting. There are very strong European specificities in this area. Take existing European law, the taxonomy regulation. Take the new sustainable finance disclosure regulation, which requires the investment community essentially to report certain quite specific things about their impacts. Take also probable forthcoming EU legislation on sustainable corporate governance and due diligence. Put all those things together and other things, and you reach the conclusion that quite a strong European approach to non-financial reporting by investee companies is going to be necessary. And it's going to be necessary to reflect the speed and the ambition of the European Green Deal. But, and of course all these things come with a but, markets are global, the sustainability crisis is global, many European companies are international. So this isn't really an either or question. Clearly we need both. We will need a strong European angle, and we will also need to see more developments and more alignment at global level. So one of our challenges, and that of other people around the world, we try to use EU work and leadership as a building block for progress at global level and towards better alignment at global level. Sorry, I think that was 8 minutes instead of 5.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for this sort of detailed reflection on the policy landscape in which this topic is operating. And if I could please ask all participants to please put their microphones on mute when they're not speaking. So now we move to the question and answer part of this panel. I want to thank the participants, the panelists, for their input so far. And we've got some questions from the audience here. First off, what do you think we can do to concretely sort of speed up the use of corporate sustainability data and information by national statistic offices for monitoring SDGs progress? Monica or Professor Giovannini, this might be particularly suited to you.
So perhaps I start then, very briefly. I think that first of all, tracking progress of the private sector towards the SDGs requires entering into data partnerships. So it must be, in my opinion, a collaborative effort, including at least 3 major actors: business community, obviously, government as well, because it's up to the government afterwards whether such data will be included into VNR reports. And obviously, the third actor is official statistical system. And quite often, the engagement of the NSO requires going beyond its traditional role. It happens in the case of Statistics Poland. So, as I've already said, this time we do not act as a provider of data, but we act as a provider of expertise and guidance. Yeah, I think that's it.
Wonderful. And does anyone else want to come in here? If not, I've got another question, which is sort of, it's fairly similar, but sort of what quality checks would you require if we could integrate, or if you could integrate data from third parties to inform assessments about SDG progress? So really how to ensure that the company's data is accountable. And perhaps, Monica, you would also be quite suited to this, but Professor Giovannini, please do step in.
Shall I start? Okay, so one of the things while ensuring accountability of data will be uniform and simple to understand methodology. And Statistics Poland, in the case of Impact Barometer, made sure that methodology, I mean definitions of indicators and explanations how to calculate them. So Statistics Poland made sure that it is uniform, simple, easy to use. Another thing that Statistics Poland has made sure concerns calculations of indicators. So Impact Barometer, as I've already said, is functions as an Excel sheet with formulas embedded in it. So all the companies have to, a company has to do is just to enter the data variables, and the indicator values are instantly calculated. However, I've also mentioned that these are just individual results, and another challenge is related to making some aggregates in order to provide some combined insights. We are still ahead of that in Poland. So that's all from me for now. Thank you.
Great. And we've got another question, and this one is to Thomas Dodd, but also to the panel as well. How can we encourage or force privately owned companies to report financial and non-financial information?
I'm happy to jump in, Helen, if useful. So I think first and foremost, this is about encouraging businesses to disclose this information. But I think one of the challenges that we face is that we often jump to the reporting very quickly in the journeys with some of these businesses. At the end of the day, this is about better business management. And if all we do in the coming years is require them to disclose more and more information that doesn't lead to better business decisions, then I think we as external agents in whatever form we're taking are making a big mistake. Now, transparency and CDP have been a leader in helping drive this transparency and getting this information out there. But we need businesses to feel like the information that we're requiring or encouraging them to disclose will actually help them make better decisions. And I think taking the systems kind of based approach, many businesses see the value in that, and whilst they realize how difficult it is to set and get to these endpoints that are ambitious, they recognize that they've got that fixed endpoint, and they can set their strategic intentions and milestones around that. So yeah, in short, this is not just about reporting, it's about how do we support businesses make better internal decisions, and then the reporting disclosure is part of that journey.
Would anyone else like to contribute? Okay. Well, here's the question for the whole panel. A sort of summary question. Given the conversation that we've been having today, what are some of the biggest challenges you all see in understanding businesses' true contribution to the SDGs?
Happy to jump in again. I think, as I said in my intervention, I think it's, and I think speaking to the other panelists' comments, this can no longer be just about marketing. We have to have common approaches to prioritizing action across all environmental, social, and other governance issues. It's no longer good enough for a business to continue to pick and choose these things. I think also secondly to that, we still somehow lack comparability in the data that businesses are putting out there, not just on how they're prioritizing issues, but on really core issues, and things like the science-based targets and the work that some of the standard setters are doing now is fantastic. But we still have a very long way to go, particularly beyond the more progressive businesses, to really get uptake at scale with comparable data.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think at this point, that brings us to the end of our Q&A interactive session, sort of with the participants. And a big thank you to our panel for contributing to such a thoughtful discussion here today on sort of measuring and disclosing the private sector's impact on the SDGs. And I'd like to now hand over to our co-host, DRI. So we've got Sarah Jane Dominic, who's the Senior Strategic Advisor at GRI, who's going to talk about, give a conclusion, but also talk about the next steps here.
Hello, thank you very much. And before I do anything, let me thank all of the speakers and CDP for co-hosting this session. What a fantastic discussion. I always learn a lot by listening to these sessions. And I think what's very clear from the breadth and depth of discussion that we've had is there are many actors in this space. And there are many that need to play a role. And it is a little bit demoralizing to hear at the beginning that we're on track to meet only 22% of environmental related SDGs. And that can be somewhat confronting. And I'm sure for the private sector, who really do have a critical role to play, I think it can be quite overwhelming. So we've heard a lot today about reporting standards, the barometer that we heard about, science-based targets, and of course, CDP and GRI mustn't neglect the role that they play as well. And we've also heard from Tom in respect of policy and what the EU are doing in terms of the new Green Deal, etc. And I think you can be overwhelmed, but I think also you can be enthused and excited by the role that the private sector can play in achieving the SDGs. And with all of these things, there are risks to be assessed and managed, such as how a changing climate affects a business model, potential revenue streams. But on the flip side, it can be a huge opportunity too. And I really did enjoy the Future Fit discussion, and this really is systemic thinking. And whilst we have to break it down so that it's digestible, and we have to start somewhere, and that's always one of my personal pleas when I do any kind of presentation, is start somewhere. It's almost better than doing nothing, and don't let perfection be the enemy of doing good in this scenario, which means starting somewhere. And I think if I look at the sort of role of the SDGs and reporting, because that's a critical role that GRI and CDP play, and if I take a quote from a professor, Carol Adams, who's an academic working in the space of SDGs and reporting, she has called on companies to consider sustainable development risks and opportunities that are relevant to their long-term value creation strategy and communicate these actual or potential impacts on the achievement of the SDGs. And I think that's all really important, that it's relevant and material disclosures. So it's not reporting for the sake of reporting. It really is reporting the relevant impacts, those relevant goals, those relevant targets within the SDGs. And that does require, going back to the discussion on the EU NFRD, that does require having some consistent framework around what companies are expected to report. And hopefully a number of you are aware of the role that GRI has been playing in this space for a number of years now. So GRI's mission is to enable organizations to be transparent. That's one thing, but then take responsibility for their impacts. So it is very much, and I think someone said it earlier, that reporting is but the first step, or managing and disclosing. Let's not forget the management, the measurement part first. But that really is not the end of the journey. Something then needs to be done with this data, and that's really important. So GRI have been working with a number of other organizations, partnering up with them to create a number of tools around how companies can measure and disclose their performance against the SDGs since they were launched back in 2015. And now we're a third of the way through those 15 years, and we have some way to go, I would say. But for those of you who aren't familiar, if you go onto our website, we have a number of tools that really do help companies think about SDGs in terms of how they match their strategy. There's the SDG compass, but also help with how you'd use the GRI standards to also report against your progress with respect to relevant goals. I think we've heard about the investment community, and certainly the role that they would play. And data is so very important, and I want to re-emphasize that, but it isn't just data for the sake of data. It is very much the right data that is accurate, that's verifiable, that has hopefully been assured, and we hear that the EU are considering how they may put requirements in to have this non-financial information assured. Because if the right, accurate data is not being provided to the capital markets, they will not shift the financial capital to push the right levers for us to really shift into a more sustainable economy, society, and planet. And if I just think about the future fit discussion, there was the whole discussion on this is systemic and the interconnectedness. And that kind of systems thinking, this isn't easy. We're at a pivotal moment now where we really need to shift. So business as usual and sort of incremental steps, they have their place, but really now the momentum is gathering and we really do need to shift from that shareholder focused value creation to this more systemic value creation. And I always like to add and destruction on there, because I think it always seems like organizations are only creating value. I think we know that that isn't true. And some initiatives are also adding in that, maintenance of value as well as creation, but also the potential to destruct. And that's certainly what we see when it comes to the climate and loss of biodiversity. So I think in my final minute, what I would just like to focus on is the private sector and their role, because lots of decisions cannot be made without this evidence-based data. And a lot of that data originates from companies themselves. So it is not possible for third parties necessarily to be able to obtain that data. And so that reporting really does start with the measurement by the private sector themselves, such that nation states and governments can actually see where it is we are in with respect to progress of meeting the global goals. And so it really is important that data is critical to that, but then it's how that data is used and the actions and decisions that are taken. And it goes around, a continuous loop of how we will, in time, have better data, but not just data for data's sake. And I think I will finish off there. But I think going back to what I said earlier, if any of you are in the private sector and wondering what to do, we've heard of a whole host of initiatives and tools that are out there, but I think it is a case of starting somewhere, and the sooner the better.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining today. Take care. Bye-bye.